At my sister's engagement dinner, my father made a joke about my little hobby in front of 40 people, and everyone laughed except me. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I folded my napkin, said goodnight, and walked out the door. 3 weeks later, when they finally reached out, I'd already built something they never saw coming. Hi, everyone. I'm Ren, 33 years old. And for most of my life, I've been the quiet one in a family that treats silence like a personal insult. Not the black sheep, not the rebel, just the one who never quite matched the volume everyone else was set to. I think before I talk, I notice before I react. In my family, that gets read as coldness. It never was. It was just who I am. For this story, I'll change our names to protect the people involved. I'll call myself Ren. My father will be Walt. My mother will be Marion. I'm the oldest of three, my brother Cole, Sancher, and my younger sister, Ivy, are Shiloh. Both still live within 20 minutes of our childhood home outside Asheville, North Carolina. I'm the only one who left. And in my family, leaving was never seen as growth. It was seen as rejection. My father, Walt, spent 30 years running a small but well-known insurance agency in town. And somewhere along the way, he decided that made him the smartest man at every table he ever sat at. He has a sharp tongue and a sharper sense of timing. He can find the one soft spot in a room and press on it just hard enough to get a laugh. Then act wounded if you call it cruelty instead of comedy. Growing up, dinner at our house wasn't a meal, it was a performance, and Walt was always the headliner. He'd needle Cole about his weight, tease Ivy about her boyfriends, and somehow, every single time, spin it so the whole table was laughing along with him instead of wondering why someone at the table looked like they wanted to disappear. I spent my 20s trying to be small enough not to be a target and successful enough not to be ignored, which is an impossible needle to thread. I got a marketing job I didn't love, stayed close enough to home to make every birthday and holiday, and smiled through comments about being too sensitive or too serious for someone so young. I told myself that was just how families worked. You show up, you take the jokes, you don't make it weird. Then, about 18 months ago, something in me finally gave out, not dramatically, just quietly, the way a rope frays before it snaps. I left my job. I moved 2 hours away to Charlotte, and I started a small brand strategy consulting business out of a one-bedroom apartment with a view of absolutely nothing special. And it was the best decision I've ever made. I didn't announce it to my family, not because I was hiding, but because I already knew the reaction. In my family, if you can't hold up your success like a trophy, a new title, a bigger house, a shinier car, it doesn't count. Quiet progress reads as failure to people who only understand loud proof. So I just worked. I didn't post about it. I didn't bring it up unless someone asked. And no one ever really asked, which brings me to the dinner. It was Ivy's engagement celebration, hosted at my parents' house, the big one. With the wraparound porch, Walt always bragged about paying off early. Extended family came. Neighbors came. A few of my parents' old church friends came. The house was packed and loud in that specific way that always drained me by the 30-minute mark. I hadn't been back in almost 4 months. Not out of spite, I'd just been busy building something that finally felt like mine. When I walked through that front door, though, I felt like a guest in a house that used to be home. The same photos on the walls, the same creaky third stair. But the way people looked at me had changed. Like I was something slightly unfamiliar that needed to be reintroduced. Well, Look who finally remembered where we live. My mother said, hugging me stiffly. I'd brought a bottle of wine. I'd actually researched something from a small vineyard one of my clients had told me about. Walt glanced at the label and said, "Did you get lost trying to find the liquor store? Or is this what passes for effort these days?" I laughed it off. I always laughed it off. That was the family currency you paid in humiliation and got approval in return. If you were lucky, dinner went the way it always went. Walt held court at the head of the table, working the room like he was auditioning for a part he already had. He told a story about Cole crashing his truck into a mailbox in high school, and everyone howled, Cole included, because that was the deal. You laughed at your own expense or you were labeled difficult. Then someone asked about Ivy's fiance's new promotion at his firm, and Walt lit up, clapping the guy on the shoulder like he'd personally recruited him into the family. My mother gushed about how ambitious everyone at the table had become. Then it happened. My mother turned to me mid-bite and said, "Ren's got her little thing going on too. Don't you, honey?" I felt it coming before it arrived. The way you feel a storm in your joints. I gave a short, honest answer. I said I was running a consulting business, that it was going well, that I had a handful of great clients. Nothing boastful, just true. Walt leaned back in his chair, grinning at the table like he'd been saving something up for exactly this moment. "Oh, right." He said, "Ren's home office empire. Sends emails in her pajamas and calls it building an empire." The table erupted. Even Ivy, the bride-to-be, laughed into her napkin. I didn't laugh. I felt heat crawl up the back of my neck. Not from embarrassment, but from the quiet certainty that nothing was ever going to be different in that house. For me. Ever. Not this year. Not any year. So I didn't argue. I didn't explain my client list or my revenue or the fact that I'd just landed a contract worth more than Walt's entire agency made in a slow month. I set my napkin on my plate, stood up, and said, "Congratulations again, Ivy. I love you." And I walked out. Nobody called that night. Nobody called the next day either. 3 days of silence. And then the text started, all with the same rehearsed concern times. "Hey, you okay, Dad was just messing around. Don't be so sensitive. We missed you at dessert." I didn't respond right away. Not out of cruelty, I just needed the silence to mean something for once, instead of being the thing I filled up apologizing into. I'd played that role 100 times, get hurt, get told I overreacted, get folded back into the group like nothing happened. Not this time. Instead, I let the messages sit while I focused on my life. My apartment, small and sun-filled, had never felt more like mine. I drank coffee by the window every morning and answered emails from clients who actually listened to me. I onboarded 2 new accounts that week. I scheduled a professional photo shoot for my growing portfolio. I was building something real. And for the first time, none of it depended on anyone at that dinner table believing in it. On day 5, Walt called. I let it ring out. 2 hours later, my mother texted Times, "It's been a week. Vren, your father's worried sick. Please don't let one little joke put a wall between us." A wall, as if that joke had been the first crack instead of the 100th. Still, I said nothing. And maybe that's exactly why. The following Saturday, they showed up at my apartment unannounced. I heard the buzzer first. Then a knock loud. Familiar. The kind that doesn't wait for an answer. I already knew before I looked through the peephole. Walt stood with his arms crossed like a coach about to bench someone. My mother held a grocery store bakery box like a peace offering, and Cole stood a step behind them, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. Vren, Walt said, his voice carefully neutral. We need to talk. I didn't move aside right away. He sighed that long. Theatrical sigh he used whenever I wasn't cooperating with the script. You've made your point. You're upset, but this is getting out of hand. I didn't ask you to come. I said, my voice came out calmer than I expected. My mother stepped forward with that gentle head tilt she always used to disarm people. We just want to understand, sweetheart, this has gone too far. Your father didn't mean any harm. I studied them for a moment, the same polite guest house expressions they wore for relatives they didn't even like. No actual remorse. Just frustration that, for once, their audience had walked out mid-show. Eventually, I stepped back and let them in, more out of curiosity than forgiveness. I wanted to hear what story they'd tell themselves. They sat stiffly on my couch while I stayed standing by the kitchen counter. Walt cleared his throat. Look, Vren, you know how I am. I joke around. Always have. You've just gotten sensitive lately. You mocked my work in front of 40 people. I said, he waved a hand. It wasn't mocking, it was teasing. Maybe if you actually told us about this business instead of keeping us in the dark, we wouldn't have to guess. My mother jumped in. We didn't even know what you were doing out there. Honey, you've shut us out. You never asked. I said, and every time I did share something, it turned into a punchline before I finished the sentence. Cole finally spoke, not quite meeting my eyes. Come on. Vren, it was a party. You know how Dad gets, did you really expect him to sit quiet while Ivy had her moment? That one actually stunned me. He wasn't even denying it was intentional, that Walt had used my life as a stepping stool to keep the spotlight on himself. And everyone at that table had known it and gone along with it anyway. I was about to ask them to leave when my mother delivered the line. I still think about, you always make everything about you. Vren, honestly, we've all been walking on eggshells around your moods for years. You're not the only one who's ever been hurt in this family. Something in me went very still because I understood, finally and completely, that no matter how calmly I explained myself, they would always find a way to make me the problem. Too sensitive, too distant, too much, and somehow never enough. Both at once. I looked at all three of them and realized I was looking at people who had never actually tried to know me, only to manage me. This is my home. I said quietly, I need you to leave. Walt stood first, red-faced but still clinging to that fake diplomatic tone. We're just trying to help. But if you'd rather sulk than be part of this family, that's on you. My mother left the bakery box on the counter like some symbolic offering and walked out without another word. Cole muttered something like, see you around, and followed. I locked the door behind them and stood in the quiet. It didn't feel lonely. For the first time, it felt earned. After that visit, I knew ignoring them wasn't enough. They weren't going to back off unless I drew a real line, not I'm hurt. But you no longer have access to me. So I started making quiet changes. I muted the family group chat, then left it entirely. I stopped answering calls that weren't emergencies. And I started building something none of them saw coming. A few weeks later, a thick cream-colored envelope arrived in the mail. Inside was Ivy's formal wedding invitation, save the date, confirmed. Venue booked. The whole production. There was no personal note to me. No mention of what had happened at the engagement dinner. Just an assumption that I'd show up, smile, and slide back into my role as the quietly obedient older sister. It was so perfectly on brand, it almost made me laugh. I folded the invitation and put it in a drawer where I'd see it, not to forget, but to remember exactly what I was working toward. Because here's the thing, my consulting business, the one Walt joked about in front of 40 people, wasn't some pajama-clad side hustle. I'd spent nearly 2 years quietly building it into something real. I specialized in helping small regional brands, boutiques, local restaurants, independent design studios restructure their marketing and scale in ways that actually held up. One client had doubled their revenue in 10 months. Another had expanded from 1 location to 4. I'd never posted a humble brag about any of it. I didn't need my family to understand it. I just needed to keep building. So I did something strategic, not petty. I reached out to a longtime client, Priya, who owned a fast-growing home goods company I'd helped rebrand the year before. I told her I was ready to open my own studio space, not some flashy launch. Just a real professional home base where I could meet clients and run workshops instead of working out of my kitchen forever. The space I found was a converted storefront in Charlotte's Arts District, about 15 minutes from the country club where Ivy's wedding reception was booked, and as it turned out, the same weekend. It wasn't planned as a statement. It just happened to be the truth of my timeline. But once I realized the dates lined up, I wasn't going to change mine to accommodate theirs. For the next month, I worked quietly. I hired a local photographer for new branding shots. I ordered simple, warm furniture, nothing showy, just intentional. I designed a space that felt like an accurate reflection of who I actually was: calm, capable, unbothered by noise. Meanwhile, the messages kept coming. Ivy times, you're still coming to the wedding, right? Don't make this weird. My mother, sending links to dresses times, something soft would look lovely on you. Dear, nothing too dark. And Walt, in a voicemail, I still remember word for word, Ren. Look, I know things have been tense, but this weekend isn't about you. It's about your sister. Just show up, smile, clap when we do the toasts, and don't cause a scene. That's all anyone's asking. No apology, no accountability, just a polite instruction to behave. They wanted a performance. They weren't going to get one from me. Instead, I sent invitations of my own, not to my family, but to the network I'd spent 2 years quietly building: clients, collaborators, a few local business owners who'd become genuine friends. The invitation read times. You're invited to the opening of Callaway Brand Studio, built on quiet persistence and the kind of ambition that doesn't need an audience to be real. The night of Ivy's wedding reception, I wore a deep green dress, not because my mother suggested a color, but because it matched the accent wall in my new studio. I spent the evening greeting guests, walking them through the space, answering questions about what I actually did for a living clearly, without a joke undercutting me every third sentence. A few guests mentioned they'd driven past the country club on their way in. Looked like a full production over there. One said, kind of over the top for a wedding reception. Honestly, I just smiled and kept moving. I hadn't needed to be at that reception. Clapping politely in a corner while Walt worked the room and made jokes about who was next to get married. I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Then, near the end of the night, there was a knock. It was Ivy, still in her reception dress, looking like she'd walked straight out of a storm instead of her own wedding. "So this is what you've been doing," she said, stepping inside without waiting to be invited. I stayed quiet, watching her take in the space, the branding on the glass, the clients mingling with wine glasses. The whole quiet proof of 2 years of work. Her expression flickered between impressed and offended. "I thought you were just busy." She said, "Everyone was asking where you were tonight." I had somewhere more important to be. I said. She blinked. "You mean this?" I nodded. "Does Dad know?" "Not yet." I said, and in that moment, I understood something I hadn't fully clocked before. She wasn't just surprised. She was rattled. Because for the first time in our lives, I had done something they couldn't shrink, muck, or manage. I had built it quietly, on my own terms. And none of them had seen it coming. She didn't stay long, mumbled something about not wanting to start drama, and left with a stiff congrats. I guess by morning, the messages had a new tone entirely. "Walt Times, heard you had some kind of event last night during your sister's wedding weekend." Real classy. Vren, "My mother Times, your sister is devastated you weren't there. You chose a work party over your own family." Cole, mom's a wreck. "You really blindsided everyone." Was this some kind of payback? I didn't answer any of it. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I'd finally learned something worth knowing. You don't have to announce that you've moved on. You just live it, quietly, and let them catch up in their own time. Word about the studio spread faster than I expected, not because I pushed it, but because a few early clients had connections. And one local business journal ran a short feature calling me the consultant who built success without the noise. That headline made me laugh out loud the first time I read it, because that's exactly what it had always been about: not making noise. Just building something that couldn't be dismantled by a joke at a dinner table. Photos from the studio opening ended up online: the clean interior, the branded signage, me standing confidently in front of a company name that was entirely, unmistakably mine. That's how my family actually found out. In the end, not from me, from a headline. Walt called 3 times that day. I let everyone ring out. Then came his text time, saw the article. So this is what all that distance was about. Couldn't even tell your own father you were starting a real business. Classic Walt, shifting the conversation from what he'd done to how I'd supposedly wronged him by succeeding quietly. My mother's message was longer. Somewhere between guilt and accusation times, we were blindsided finding out like this. "You've clearly been busy. This family isn't perfect. But we've always loved you. Are you really going to throw away years over one joke?" They still didn't understand. It was never about one joke. It was about a lifetime of being the punchline, the afterthought, the one who got told she was too sensitive every time she asked for basic respect. But things were different now, and that difference became impossible to ignore a few weeks later. A former client, a woman I'd helped grow her boutique furniture line from a single storefront into a regional presence, invited me to speak on a small business panel at a regional entrepreneurship conference. It wasn't huge, but the local business community showed up in force. I almost declined. Then I found out who else would be there. Walt, as it turned out, wasn't speaking. His agency had merged with a larger firm the year before, and he'd been quietly moved into an advisory role, which everyone in the industry understood to mean he was no longer the one steering the ship. He was attending as someone else's guest. I didn't make a scene when I saw him in the crowd. I found my seat on the panel, clipped on my microphone, and waited for my turn. We talked about growth, setbacks, the reality of building something without family backing. I spoke about what it means to grow a business when the people closest to you are the loudest doubters, and how quiet, Consistent work can outlast any amount of noise thrown at it. When the panel ended, people came up afterward. One older woman, calm and direct, told me, "You clearly come from tough stock to build all that on your own." I just smiled. The irony wasn't lost on me. I saw Walt on my way to the parking lot. He was standing near the exit, arms crossed, jaw tight. Quite the speech. He said, "You've got a real talent for making a point without naming names." You said it. I told him, "Not me." He waited for me to fill the silence. I didn't. So that's it. Then he finally said, "You're just done with us." I met his eyes. "I'm done pretending you were ever actually on my side." Then I walked to my car. I didn't look back, not even when I heard him say my name one more time under his breath. The months that followed were quiet on their end. No more calls. No more voicemails. No more surprise visits with grocery store pie. A kind of peace I'd never had access to before. My business kept growing. I brought on a part-time associate. I started getting invited to speak at small business events around the state. My name started meaning something outside the walls of that house I grew up in. Ivy reached out once more, through a mutual friend, asking if I'd reconsider coming to a family gathering that fall. I said no, gently. Not out of spite, but because I no longer had room in my life for being the afterthought everyone tolerated for the sake of appearances. Cole posted a vague status once about family members who change once they get a little success. I didn't respond. Walt and my mother slowly faded, not out of my memory, but out of relevance. I never blocked them. I just stopped making space for them to hurt me on a schedule. And for the first time in my life, I felt genuinely free. Not because I got revenge. I never wanted revenge. Not really. I wanted to stop shrinking. They still have their dinner table, their jokes, their need for an audience. I have my name on a studio door, clients who respect my work, and a life where I no longer have to make myself smaller to be let back to the table. That was all the closure I ever needed. If this story meant something to you, or reminded you of your own table full of people who never quite made room for you, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. And if you want more stories like this one, stick around, there's more where this came from.